January 17, 1943, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The night hung thick over the jungle, a suffocating blanket of humidity that turned breath into steam and cloth into wet rags against the skin. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the Pacific Ocean rolled in endless black swells, invisible but present in the salt that clung to every surface. In a hastily erected tent near Henderson Field, 40 men sat on ammunition crates and overturned helmets, their faces illuminated by the uncertain flicker of kerosene lamps that cast dancing shadows against canvas walls. These were not the clean-cut heroes of recruitment posters. Their service records bore the red stamps of disciplinary action: brawlers, thieves, men who'd stolen jeeps for joyrides, struck officers, gone AWOL to chase women or whiskey in port towns from San Diego to Pearl Harbor. The Marine Corps and Navy had branded them troublemakers, malcontents, the dregs that settle at the bottom of every military barrel. Yet here they sat, scrubbing rifle barrels and checking the edge on Ka-Bar knives, because someone in naval intelligence had decided that the qualities that made them criminals might be precisely what made them useful. Outside, the jungle pulsed with the electric buzz of insects and the occasional distant crack of sniper fire. They had been told nothing except to be ready before dawn. Ready for what? They could only imagine. But imagination in the South Pacific, where men had watched their friends torn apart by artillery or swallowed by crocodile-infested rivers, tended toward the darkest possibilities. The war in the Pacific had, by early 1943, become a grinding contest of islands, each one a separate hell of coral, jungle, and entrenched Japanese defenders, who had learned that America's industrial might meant little when battles came down to caves and bunkers and hand-to-hand fighting in the darkness. Guadalcanal itself had been a 6-month bloodbath that ended only 2 months prior, leaving the island studded with the wreckage of ships and aircraft. The earth churned into mud that would not wash clean of blood. The Japanese Empire, despite losses, still controlled thousands of miles of Pacific territory, still held island fortresses considered impregnable, still fought with a ferocity born from Bushido code that made surrender unthinkable. American planners faced a terrible arithmetic. Conventional amphibious assaults cost thousands of lives per island, and there were hundreds of islands between Guadalcanal and Tokyo. Something had to change. Someone needed to go first to scout the killing grounds, to slip behind enemy lines and discover where the guns were hidden, where the bunkers connected, how many men waited in the darkness. But who sends conventional troops on suicide reconnaissance missions when the enemy outnumbers them 700 to 1? Who volunteers to paddle a rubber raft onto a hostile beach at midnight, knowing that 30,000 Japanese soldiers wait somewhere beyond the surf line? The answer, as it happened, was no one. No one volunteers for certain death, not really, but men who have already been marked as expendable, whose files are stained with courts-martial and brig time, whose futures hold only more punishment or dishonorable discharge. These men might be persuaded, cajoled, or simply ordered into darkness without the Navy mourning their loss. Lieutenant Commander Draper Kaufman thought differently. He saw something else in the disciplinary files stacked on his field desk. Kaufman himself was an outsider, a man who'd been rejected by the Naval Academy due to poor eyesight, who'd driven ambulances for the French during the Battle of France, who defused bombs for the British during the Blitz before America even entered the war. He understood that courage often wore disguises, that the same recklessness that led a man to punch a superior officer might, under different circumstances, lead him to swim 3 miles through enemy-controlled waters carrying demolition charges. The Naval Combat Demolition Units, precursors to what would later be called underwater demolition teams, and eventually Navy SEALs, were built from such logic. Take men who couldn't conform, wouldn't submit to ordinary discipline, who possessed some excess of physical courage or rage or indifference to death, and give them a mission that matched their nature. The 40 men on Guadalcanal that January night represented the first experiment in this theory. Their orders, when they finally came at 400 hours, were simple in articulation but staggering in implication. They would infiltrate Japanese-held islands ahead of marine amphibious assaults. They would swim, paddle, and crawl onto hostile shores at night. They would map defenses, blow obstacles, eliminate sentries, and somehow survive to radio back intelligence before the main force arrived. If they failed, the Marines would land blind into prepared killing zones. If they succeeded, thousands of American lives might be saved. The mathematics were cold, utilitarian. 40 men, most with criminal records, in exchange for potentially thousands of Marines with clean files and families waiting at home. It was a calculus that military planners could embrace without guilt. What those planners perhaps didn't understand was what these 40 men expected of themselves and each other. They'd grown up during the Depression, most of them, in mining towns or prairie farms or urban tenements where violence was the native language of survival. They'd enlisted or been drafted, chafed under the rigid hierarchies of military life, rebelled in ways both petty and profound. They expected to be used and discarded, to die anonymously on some unnamed beach and be buried, expected that the officers who commanded them viewed them as biological sandbags, bodies to absorb bullets meant for more valuable men. And perhaps most significantly, they expected the enemy to be superhuman. Propaganda had painted the Japanese as fanatic warriors who could survive without food, see in total darkness, endure any hardship. The myth of Japanese invincibility, despite Guadalcanal's outcome, still lingered in the American consciousness. These men expected to face an enemy superior in training, discipline, and willingness to die. What they experienced instead, in the months that followed that January night, shattered every expectation and rebuilt them into something else entirely. The first mission came 3 weeks later, on February 8, 1943, targeting a small fortified island called Rendova in the New Georgia Group. 8 men from the unit paddled a rubber raft through 12 miles of open ocean at night, navigating by stars and compass toward an island Japanese intelligence reported held approximately 300 defenders. The plan called for them to scout the beaches, identify obstacles, and return before dawn. Simple, suicidal. The ocean was black glass that night, phosphorescence trailing from their paddles like liquid fire that could betray their position to any watching eyes. The sound of surf against coral grew louder as they approached, a grinding roar that both masked their movement and terrified them. Breaking waves on coral reefs could flip a raft, could leave a man swimming in darkness, bleeding from cuts while sharks circled below. They beached the raft on a narrow strip of sand, covered it with palm fronds, and began moving inland. Lieutenant Junior Grade John Bell, leading the patrol, expected to encounter sentries within minutes. He'd studied Japanese defensive tactics, knew they favored interlocking fields of fire, knew they'd dig spider holes and camouflage them so perfectly that a man could step over one without seeing the soldier hidden below, ready to thrust a bayonet into his groin. He expected every shadow to erupt with gunfire. They moved like men walking through a minefield, each step a negotiation with death. But the jungle remained silent except for the sounds of nature, the shriek of fruit bats, the rustle of something large in the underbrush. 2 hours of careful advance brought them to the high ground overlooking what dawn revealed was chaos of a different kind. The Japanese position was there, exactly where intelligence had placed it: dugouts, ammunition stores, a field kitchen. But it was abandoned. Not recently abandoned in response to their approach, but weeks abandoned, judging by the vegetation reclaiming the trenches. Bell found documents in one dugout, orders dated to December, plans for a withdrawal that had apparently been executed without American intelligence learning of it. The 300 defenders had melted away, likely pulled north to reinforce positions under heavier pressure. The beach obstacles that needed mapping, consisted of a few coral outcroppings and some rotting barbed wire. The mission, prepared as a suicide run, had become a lonely walk through a ghost fortress. But something more valuable than intelligence was discovered in that abandonment. Inside what had been the Japanese headquarters, the men found evidence of conditions they'd never imagined the invincible enemy enduring. Medical logs detailed deaths from malaria, dysentery, malnutrition. Supply manifests showed rations of rice and dried fish so meager that even by Japanese military standards, notoriously harsh, they constituted starvation. A diary belonging to a junior officer, translated later, spoke of men too weak to dig fortifications, of untreated wounds festering in the tropical heat, of waiting for supply ships that never came because American submarines controlled the waters. The image of the superhuman enemy began to crack. These were men who suffered, who hungered, who died of disease and neglect far from home, fighting for an empire that couldn't feed them. The pattern repeated across dozens of missions in the months that followed. The combat demolition team struck Munda, Kalimanjaro, Vela, islands where intelligence estimates of Japanese strength proved vastly inflated, where the defenders they found were often starving, disease-ridden, cut off from resupply, their vaunted discipline eroding under the unrelenting pressure of American air and sea superiority. At Vela in August 1943, a 10-man team inserted to scout beaches for the Marine landing found a Japanese supply dump that revealed the true state of the enemy's logistics. Rations of weevil-infested rice mixed with sawdust to bulk it out. A field hospital that consisted of dirty bandages and a case of morphine syrettes, most already used, and a stack of letters from soldiers to their families that would never be mailed because no ships came anymore. One letter, carried back and translated, spoke of dreams of rice balls and miso soup, of hunger so constant it became a kind of companion, of watching comrades die not in glorious combat but from simple infected blisters that turned septic without antibiotics. The 40 men, the criminals and misfits, began to understand something profound. They had been sent expecting to face supermen and found instead that war reduced all men to the same fundamental struggles: hunger, disease, fear, exhaustion. The Japanese soldiers were brave, yes, often fighting to the last man rather than surrender, but their bravery existed within a system that viewed them as expendable, that supplied them with doctrine and emperor worship but not adequate food or medicine. In contrast, even the Americans deemed criminal and sent on the most dangerous missions received rations that included canned fruit, chocolate bars, cigarettes, coffee. Their rubber rafts were manufactured with specifications ensuring maximum reliability. Their weapons were cleaned and tested to exacting standards. Their wounds, if they survived to receive treatment, would be addressed with sulfa drugs, whole blood transfusions, penicillin, medical miracles the Japanese army doctors could only dream of. Petty Officer Second Class James Reeves, who'd served 30 days in the brig for stealing a staff car to visit his girl in Honolulu, kept a personal log not officially sanctioned, but tolerated because Kaufman valued after-action observations from any source. In an entry from September 1943, after a mission to scout Choiseul Island, Reeves wrote, "We ate better tonight pork and beans from a can, peaches and syrup, real coffee, than what I figure the Jap colonel in his bunker has eaten in a month. Found their supply tent today. Hardtack and dried squid and not much of that. They're tough bastards to keep fighting on empty. Makes me think maybe we're tough too, but we're tough with full bellies and bullets to spare. That's a different kind of war." The observation, crude in its phrasing, cut to the heart of the Pacific War's hidden reality. American abundance, the industrial capacity that could produce landing craft and bombers and artillery shells in quantities that staggered imagination, extended even to its outcasts and criminals. The Empire of Plenty fed its worst soldiers better than Japan fed its best. This realization didn't soften the 40 men or make them less effective. If anything, it sharpened them. They began to take pride not in their criminal pasts, but in their present expertise. They became the best at what they did because what they did was impossible, and surviving the impossible built a new kind of identity. They invented techniques as they went, using inflatable lifebelts as flotation for demolition charges, developing hand signals for underwater communication, learning to navigate by the sets of waves and the smell of vegetation on the wind. They lost men, of course. On New Georgia, 2 were killed by a hidden machine gun nest that opened fire as they marked a beach. At Bougainville, 1 drowned when his raft overturned in the surf and his equipment pulled him under before his teammates could reach him. At Emerau, another was killed by friendly fire when a nervous Marine sentry shot at movement in the darkness. Each death was mourned, but the missions continued because the calculus remained unchanged. Their deaths, tragic as they were, saved hundreds of Marines who would have landed on uncleared beaches into unmarked minefields. By late 1943, the Navy began to recognize what Kaufman had understood from the beginning. These men, forged from indiscipline and given purpose, had become something uniquely valuable. Their criminal records, rather than being liabilities, were evidence of the independent thinking and risk tolerance necessary for their work. Formal training programs began at Fort Pierce, Florida, selecting not just from the brig files now but recruiting volunteers who showed the same qualities: physical toughness, mental resilience, and a certain creative disregard for conventional wisdom. The curriculum was brutal: extended swims in cold water, demolition training with live explosives, survival exercises where instructors deliberately tried to make students quit. Only about 1 in 4 completed the course. Those who graduated wore no special insignia yet, no trident pin, but they knew what they were: men who went first into hell so others might follow. The symbolic object that bound these men together, curiously, was not a weapon or a piece of equipment but a can of peaches. It became a tradition, born from one of the early missions, that if a team successfully completed a reconnaissance and returned alive, they would share a can of peaches in heavy syrup before debriefing. The ritual was partly practical. The sugar and calories restored energy after hours of physical exertion, but mostly psychological. The peaches represented everything about American capacity that their enemy lacked. Peaches grown in California or Georgia, picked and canned with industrial efficiency, shipped across thousands of miles of ocean, delivered even to the forward edges of combat, perfectly preserved in sealed tins that could survive being dropped from airplanes or submerged in salt water. Japanese soldiers were eating sawdust mixed with rice. American criminals were eating peaches in syrup. The contrast was almost obscene in its totality. Before one mission to scout Saipan in early 1944, where Japanese forces numbered over 30,000 entrenched defenders, Seaman First Class Miguel Torres held up a can of peaches during the pre-mission briefing and said, "This is what we're fighting for, you know." Not the tin. What the tin means somewhere back home there's orchards and canneries and girls working the line packing this, means logistics and railroads and ships, means a country that can worry about peaches while fighting a war. The Japs, they're fighting for their emperor and tradition and all that. We're fighting for a place that cans peaches and ships them to the ass end of nowhere, so a bunch of criminals can eat them before swimming onto a beach where 30,000 guys want to kill us. I'll take our side of that trade. The men laughed, but the point landed. They were expendable in the formal military calculus, but they were fed, equipped, and extracted with an attention to logistics that spoke to a deeper value system. Even the expendable, in American democracy, were not abandoned or forgotten. The Saipan mission in June 1944 represented the culmination of everything the combat demolition units had learned. Intelligence estimated 30,000 Japanese defenders on an island 3 miles wide and 12 miles long. The beach obstacles were reported to be extensive: mines, barbed wire, concrete tetrahedrons, wooden stakes designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. The Marines would assault in waves of thousands, but first the beaches had to be mapped and cleared. Lieutenant Commander Kaufman personally led the mission, taking 30 men from the original 40 criminals plus newer volunteers. They went in the night before the invasion, swimming through dark water toward an island that was, effectively, a fortress. The ocean was colder than they expected this far north, and the distance, 2 miles from the submarine that inserted them to the beach, left them exhausted before the actual work began. What they found on Saipan was the most sophisticated Japanese defense they'd yet encountered. Bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, artillery pre-sighted on the beaches, minefields mapped in complex patterns. But they also found evidence of strain in the defense. Supply shortages had forced the Japanese to use inferior explosives in some mines. Food stores uncovered near the beach were even more depleted than those seen on earlier islands. A command post they infiltrated briefly, a terrifying few minutes of holding their breath in the darkness, while officers moved past, contained maps showing defensive positions that weren't fully manned because troops had been pulled to reinforce other sectors. The invincible fortress had cracks. Over 2 nights, the combat demolition teams worked in the darkness, marking obstacles with waterproof tape, placing demolition charges on the worst barriers, mapping safe lanes for the landing craft. They did this while Japanese patrols passed within yards, while searchlights swept the water, while the constant fear of discovery made every minute stretch into hours. 2 men were wounded by a grenade when a patrol stumbled onto their position. They killed the Japanese soldiers silently with knives and kept working, blood mixing with salt water as they swam to the next obstacle. When the Marines landed on June 15, 1944, in one of the largest amphibious assaults of the Pacific War, they hit beaches that had been cleared and marked by men the Marines would never meet, whose names appeared in no official histories of the battle. The invasion of Saipan still cost thousands of American lives. The Japanese fought with desperate courage, but it would have cost. After Saipan came Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each island a separate hell, each requiring the same terrifying preparatory missions. The men of the combat demolition units grew from 40 to hundreds, then thousands as the war expanded. The training formalized, the techniques refined, the lessons written into doctrine, but something essential remained unchanged. These remained men comfortable with operating outside normal structures, who thrived in chaos, who could improvise solutions when plans dissolved into the fog of war. The criminal background became less literal as volunteer standards rose, but the psychological profile remained. These were men who questioned authority productively, who saw rules as guidelines rather than sacred writ, who possessed the peculiar courage required to volunteer for missions that had no glory because they happened in secret, and the success metric was merely survival. The transformation these men underwent was not from criminal to hero. That narrative would be too simple, too clean. Many remained rough characters who drank too much on leave, got into fights, chafed at garrison duty. The transformation was more subtle. From men society had labeled expendable to men who'd proven their value in the most fundamental currency possible, the lives they saved through missions no one else could accomplish. They'd gone expecting to be used as cannon fodder by officers who viewed them as biological sandbags. They'd found instead leaders like Kaufman, who understood that courage came in unconventional packages, that the same qualities that made a man unsuited for peacetime discipline might make him invaluable in war's extremes. They'd expected to face superhuman enemies, and discovered instead that all soldiers, regardless of nation or ideology, were reduced to the same essentials by modern warfare's industrial brutality. And perhaps most significantly, they'd learned that their own country, despite viewing them as criminals, still fed them peaches and brought them home when possible, still treated their wounds and honored their service, because even the worst Americans were citizens of a democracy that valued life differently than their enemy's empire valued death, demanded death before dishonor, but couldn't provide adequate ammunition or medical supplies. The Americans who became the first combat demolition teams, by contrast, existed within a system so materially abundant that even its outcasts received better logistics than the enemy's elite. That difference, not racial, not cultural in the way propaganda suggested, but industrial and systematic, determined the war's outcome more than any individual battle. Japan could produce brave soldiers. America could produce brave soldiers and keep them supplied with everything from penicillin to canned peaches, even at the far reaches of the Pacific's vastness. The epilogue of these 40 men's story extends beyond the war's end in August 1945. Most survived, statistically improbable given the missions they undertook. They returned to an America that had no parades for men whose service was classified, whose missions appeared in no newspaper headlines. Some stayed in the military, forming the core of what would become the underwater demolition teams and eventually the Navy SEALs. Others returned to civilian life, carrying with them the knowledge that they had been judged expendable by society's peacetime standards and proven invaluable by war's harsh metrics. Their criminal records, for those who'd had them, were quietly expunged or ignored in light of service rendered. In the decades that followed, as the SEALs became legendary for operations from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan, few knew that the lineage traced back to 40 men marked as criminals in 1943, sent to face 30,000 Japanese with the assumption they'd be lost, but the hope they'd be useful. The larger truth their experience revealed cuts deeper than military history. In war's extremity, all pretenses burn away, leaving only what's essential. Men need food, medicine, equipment, and leadership that views them as more than expendable resources. Systems that cannot provide these things, whether from industrial incapacity or ideological contempt for individual life, lose wars regardless of their soldiers' bravery. The Japanese Empire's greatest weakness was not its soldiers' courage, which was abundant, but its inability to sustain them materially and its unwillingness to value their lives strategically. They fought with a desperation born from knowing their nation viewed their deaths as offerings to the emperor rather than losses to be minimized. The Americans, even the criminals and misfits, fought knowing that their country would feed them, supply them, and try to bring them home. That knowledge didn't make them softer, it made them bolder. Men fight more fiercely when they believe their lives have value beyond their utility in dying. The can of peaches, that absurd symbol, embodied this truth. It represented orchards and farmers, canneries and workers, railroads and ports, merchant ships and supply officers, all working in concert to ensure that even the furthest-flung soldier received not just rations but variety, not just calories but comfort. The Japanese soldier, eating sawdust mixed with rice while defending an emperor he'd never met, fought bravely within a system that consumed him. The American criminal, eating peaches before swimming into darkness to face that enemy, fought within a system that, for all its flaws and prejudices, still tried to sustain him. The difference between those two systems determined not just battles but the war entire, and ultimately the shape of the peace that followed. In the end, the 40 men labeled criminals and sent to face 30,000 Japanese taught the American military something vital. That valor cannot be predicted by peacetime conformity, that the same rebellious spirit that breaks rules in garrison might be precisely what's needed when missions require thinking beyond doctrine. They proved that men judged expendable could become invaluable when given purpose and leadership worthy of their sacrifice. And they demonstrated, through survival rates that defied the odds, that a military machine built on abundance and a political system built on the premise that even criminal lives have worth will outlast any empire built on glory and contempt for individual survival. The legacy of those first combat demolition units lives in every Navy SEAL who volunteers for missions that have no glory, in every special operator who goes first into darkness so others might follow, in the enduring understanding that democracy's warriors, however flawed in peacetime, possess a flexibility and resilience that rigid authoritarian systems cannot replicate. They were criminals who became the template for heroes, not through redemption narratives, but through the simple, brutal proof that they could do what needed doing and survive to do it again. The can of peaches, shared after each mission, was both celebration and symbol, a reminder that they fought for a country that could afford peaches even in war, that valued them enough to ship sweetness across the Pacific, that brought them home when it could and mourned them when it couldn't. That, in the end, was the difference that mattered. Not just firepower or tactics, but the underlying belief that every man, even the criminals, was worth more alive than dead, worth feeding and equipping and leading, worth the extraordinary logistics required to sustain warriors at the edge of the world. From that belief, tempered in the darkness of those early missions, forged in the waters off hostile shores, emerged not just a military unit but a tradition, one that recognizes courage in unconventional forms, that transforms society's outcasts into the tip of the spear, that understands the deepest truth of democratic warfare, that free men, even flawed ones, fighting for a cause they've chosen with full bellies and adequate equipment, will prevail against conscripts and fanatics fighting for ideologies that cannot feed them or systems that view their deaths as cheaper than their supplies. The 40 criminals became the ancestors of the SEALs not despite their pasts, but because their pasts prepared them for missions requiring the same qualities that had made them unsuitable for conventional service: improvisation, independence, the courage to act when all the safe choices are gone. They swam into history's darkness and returned carrying the knowledge that America's strength lay not in its ability to produce perfect soldiers, but in its capacity to use imperfect men perfectly, to feed even its outcasts, to value life enough to risk it wisely rather than spend it cheaply. That lesson, learned in the waters off Guadalcanal and proven across dozens of Pacific islands, remains the foundation of special operations doctrine. Send the right men, equipped and trained and led with care, into impossible situations, and sometimes, against all odds, they come back having accomplished the impossible. And when they do, share the peaches, for they've earned the sweetness, and the sweetness itself is worth defending, worth swimming through dark waters, worth facing 30,000 enemies, worth transforming from criminal to warrior for a cause that can fruit and ships it to the edge of war, because even there, especially there, men deserve to